if then we look at the Doomsmith situation, which is really where I want to go with this.
Okay.
I'm going to say that in multiple places throughout the text, which I have now perused, right? In multiple places throughout the text, I find a certain difficulty in setting up crisis at the character level and resolving crisis in story terms, or more accurately, how is this going to work out? What I mean is that if you look at Destiny as a whole, and certain phrasings of pieces within it, some of them count, some of them don't. Saying, I'm a coward doesn't count because we don't know how that's going to turn out in a situation. You could be very cowardly and it might turn out to be the most awesome thing you possibly could have done, right? We don't know. Whereas there are others that are more like consequence-based. Whatever I do turns out badly. I mean, if you're just talking as your character's history, that's fine. But if you're talking about it as a predictive, that's a little different. I just made that one up. But there are others that I think you'll look at them and you will see that they are more descriptions of how things turn out than of how things are going in to a situation.
Okay.
And then if we look at certain upbringings, or rather the abilities and categories and stuff that they contain, which is the most important part, right? The things you can take from your upbringings. Doombringer is a good one. They also have a way, in many cases, of being after what happens rather than going into what happens. And then if we look at consequences of certain abilities or certain things that can happen to you, they also have a way of saying, okay, well, and now all of this is going to go to shit, or whatever. I'm just picking the dark side because it's easy to talk about. And that's fine, because those are consequences. You have to get there through a series of roles, steps, and actions. But let's say I'm playing with those consequences on the table, and I wish I knew the system a little bit better, but if you can kind of try and think about one where this set of circumstances is really going to make this whole scenario really spiral into darkness. And it's probably not a single role, and it shouldn't be just a single role. It is a set of interacting roles and actions. But what if I have Doombringer? Isn't that already kind of front-loading the whole thing?
Kind of, yeah.
And that's what I'm saying. There are two things at work. One is the concept of redundancy. If you're going to have consequences like that in certain mechanics of activity, then why bother having Doombringer at all? We'll find out who's the Doombringer by playing. So there's a redundancy there. Almost as if we're putting Doombringer into the stuff, the character creation options, sort of to remind the player that this could happen. But the point is that if you've got solid mechanics for that kind of outcome to occur, don't front load it by making it a character trait. You could give a character trait that feeds into those mechanisms very well. Has some sort of consequence on those roles, or an affinity for that path of activity, but isn't in and of itself a description of the outcome. You've got the consequence mechanics for that. So do you see what I mean by redundancy? There are several, actually. I wouldn't bring it up if I hadn't seen it in multiple places. And especially since it includes options for phrasing within the Destiny. That's a really difficult thing. Let's say I've got a predictive in my Destiny. To die in a ditch is one of them, I think, that you have listed.
Mhm.
Now, I know, based on talking with you, that you're pretty much posing that as a situation with its own internal resolution during play, such that you might not have died in a ditch after all.
Right.
And if the moment of not dying in a ditch was climactic enough, we might as well say, okay, that particular detail of the destiny has met its fate, and we're done with that. But do you see that in many cases, by phrasing it in that way, that it can be treated as a predictive?
I totally get that with the destinies, because it's something that we have dealt with when people write their books. And I noticed when we first started playing the game, the books were always very single-minded, such as like one was I stand on my own, and and the other book that this character had, it was I will protect my child. And so it was very easy to come up with situations where she had the option to go off and do something on her own, or
right
to protect the child. But I noticed as time has gone on that the players sometimes have written more and more into their books. So it's not just, we're going up against some monster and I need some items. So instead of finding, find a way to beat this monster, or find a weapon, it's like trying to go find this kind of weapon in this place.
It becomes more of a strategy device. Right.
So, I definitely get those things.
Let's take
now. I was going to say, when it comes to some of the upbringing, there was a game that we played where a guy knew from the beginning, I want a tragic character, and he chose tragic figure, and it's this whole revenge story. We know that it's going to end tragically, and it was about, well, how does it end tragically? In which way? And as we're driving it, it was this beautiful revenge story where his, it turns out he was a noble and his wife was a demon. And when he arrives, because of how he wrote his books, and there, I play with the books and I twist and I kind of interpret them differently. It turns out that he didn't know it, but he had kids. He had these twins. So he's all hell bent on revenge. But then it comes down to, well, his kids have grown. They protect the mother. And is he going to throw down his vengeance in order, And it turns out to this just absolute massacre, and it's utterly tragic. But we knew that was going to happen in some way.
Well, that's the interesting point, though. Do you want to know? And and sometimes the framing you're talking about is positive, and yet it does seem to me to have a very difficult thing to do for the Doomsmith. I don't know if this phrasing is going to help you, but if the components of the system don't know if they're coming or going, then I have a very hard time deciding what to do with them. You say that the player wanted this to be a tragic story. Well, it's still on him. He can still make the decisions as he goes through play that are in line with that. But those are all decisions rolling forwards. And by taking tragic figure, are you saying how it's going to turn out, or are you asking whether it's going to turn out this way? Like the die in a ditch. If it's treated as, will I die in a ditch? That's one thing. If it says, die in a ditch, and that's how it's going to be no matter what I do, that's another. I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, but that kind of front loading doesn't really go well with a number of other things you've got going on in your system.
So with the Destiny, it's always a what if. It's always there's always, you're always being thrown in that direction. You're gonna die in a ditch while you're walking home. You're getting attacked. That's maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow,
right.
but maybe one day. We'll see. But choosing some of these more fatalistic things, such as tragic character, that it's going to be that way.
Well, that's an important point. In that case, those are two different categories. Mm-hmm. Those are two different categories, and if they're both going to exist in the game, they need to be under different categories. So this has a different relationship for the Doomsmith in terms of preparation for things. I'm going to go a little further and state that I think your definitions for paths and concessions are quite problematic. It's almost, I can almost see that your writing was just kind of you kind of working your way through it as you go, so that even if they seem very clear to you, I'm finding them unusable. And the reason for that is that some of them are. I'm gonna pull up your definite. Just to be a pain in the butt, I'm gonna actually take it here. Right? We have concessions are things that would pull your character away from their destiny or conflict with other paths. So we can't do concessions until we do the first two. All right. So let's go back up the line. Paths represent events that you think would cause your character's soul to grow stronger. That's a fine thing. They may be goals or situations. In fact, or which includes something that the character doesn't want. Now, so they're written as goals, situations, higher appreciations, or moral maxims. All of these are very strong in the way you're phrasing them. But if we look at your examples, if we were to go right off those phrasings, I wouldn't have any problem at all. But now let's look for let's look at your examples. And I submit that they aren't all actual examples of what we're talking about and are hard to use. And then we go over to concessions, we find the same thing. There are things that I'm not entirely certain are situation building. Like, for example, stowaway on the merchant ship. Does that mean I'm starting on this as a stowaway, or does that mean I'm going to end up being a stowaway? I have to get kind of airlifted into the stowaway situation sooner or later. I'm not sure what to do with these. Well, anyway, I'm not sure I'm stating this very clearly. What I'm trying to say is better illustrated through an example. Okay. Which is going to be a lot more specific than what your system has. One of the things about what I'm trying to say about the destinies, paths, and concessions for me, and this has everything to do with practical play, is rather than throw it open, it could be a goal, it could be a situation, it could be an ideal, it could be an opportunity, right? That it could be anything, damn it. Let's not let it be anything. Let's consider the idea of the game The Whispering Vault, which I've just replayed recently. In The Whispering Vault, the characters are dead and are now sort of their essential selves, helping humanity in situations of grave metaphysical crisis. Each one has 5 keys, which are called its keys of humanity. One of them has to be compassion. But they are defined as virtues and faults, and maybe a couple of other things. But the virtues and faults I wanted to focus on. The virtue is something that was considered virtuous by the character's original culture, because the characters could come from any human place in history. So you would pick wherever they were from, and you say, what's something that this culture would have found virtuous? And my character's like that. But you'll notice that it's very specifically nothing to do with what the character thinks of it. It's only what their culture thought of it. Whereas the character's fault, if they have faults, if they have virtues, if they have faults, faults are things that the character doesn't approve of in themselves. So the criteria for picking virtues and the criteria for picking faults are very different. They don't overlap. I mean, the same word might show up in each one, but they don't overlap in terms of concept. And so I know what I'm doing when I pick a virtue. I know what I'm doing when I pick a fault. And that's what I have trouble with the books.